Hello again, and welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346. And today we're going to be talking about some more of the foundational theories of social psychology. So another aspect of social psychology that we'll be mentioning this quarter is some of the evolutionary considerations of how we interact with other people. A lot of the research is based on Darwin's research and natural selection. And we find that there are some evolutionary foundations of some of the research that we're going to be talking about. So for example, we see that there are some universal human emotions and human behaviors that exist across all people, regardless of culture or background. We see that language is extremely important and is really only important for group living, for interacting with people. If we were by ourselves, we wouldn't need language. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about theory of mind, which is understanding other people's beliefs and desires and being able to act and interact with them with this knowledge in mind, being able to understand why people do what they do. We tend to see that autistic people have some trouble with this. They also have trouble with picking up on social cues, which we'll talk about. But really, when you think about it, theory of mind is critical to be able to study psychology, to be able to understand why people do the things that they do. We'll talk a little bit about parental roles and gender roles, and especially how evolutionary foundations have driven gender roles in society and how some of this might be able to change depending on certain situations. We'll talk about social neuroscience, how some emotions are specific to certain brain regions, how we see the brain develop and how that can be consistent across cultures, across societies. So for example, we might see that people take higher risks because there's some poor brain development in certain regions of the brain. So there are some biological determinants for some of these behaviors that we have. We'll also talk about some cultural differences in social psychological research. We often see that different cultures have different beliefs, different values, different preferences. We see that certain cultures have differences in self-concept, how they understand who they are, and differences in social existence and cognitions. They interact with each other differently. They believe that interactions should follow different patterns and different hierarchies, for example. We'll talk about the differences between independent and interdependent societies and how the relationships that we form with others may be more important in certain societies and certain cultures compared to others. And we'll talk about differences in gender roles and socialization by culture. We'll talk about regional differences in how we interact with others. So for example, within each culture, there may be different subcultures or different regions within different nations that interact with each other in completely different ways. We'll talk about one example of this will be the culture of honor. And additionally, we'll talk about differences in class. Class is extremely important for social interactions. This knowledge can determine how people interact with others, especially when we see interactions between people of different classes. We'll talk a little bit about how that might be predicted by some of the research in social psychology. And overall, social psychology is different from other fields of psychology and other sciences. So for example, social psychology is different from personality psychology. Personality psychology is focusing more on individual differences rather than interactions between different people. Cognitive psychology is focusing more on non-social and more internal processes than social psychology. And if we think about sociology, that's focusing more on the characteristics and behaviors of populations or societies or cultures as a whole, rather than individuals and how they might interact with other individuals. And this social psychological research can be applied to many different fields and many different career paths. For example, we can use social psychological research to help with eyewitness testimony or how to deal with juries in a courtroom setting. We can use that research to help with perceptions of health, help people feel more supported socially, and help people cope with stress in a more medical applied setting. And lastly, we can use this research to apply it to a more business setting. So for example, a lot of the research can be used in marketing and decision making and help with business operations. So there are many applications of social psychology, not only within social psychological research, but also outside of social psychology and even outside of psychology. So thank you again for your time and attention. That's all we have for today. I will see you next time. Thanks.